Hi friends, today I am going to discuss about exception handling in Spring Boot. So you already know how to handle the exception in a Java application like using a try catch block. Okay, so if exception occurred in any class, any like controller or service class, any other class, okay, you are handling the exception using a try catch block. Okay, so you want to throw that error and display that error exception whatever uh, occurred in the any class of application in a particular format. So you want to maintain a particular format, right? So you want to create a global exception handler, so that any suppose if you have n controllers like controller 1 2 3 4, some n number of controllers, or like service class 1 2 3 4 n number of service class. Suppose if exception occurred in any of these classes, so we want to handle that exception globally. So that is through controller advice exception handler class. So in this exception controller handler class, so we will handle all type of exception, whatever it is, may be custom exception, or it may be the runtime exception, or any kind of exception. So that will be handled in a global exception handler class called controller advice. Okay, so Spring Boot provides an annotation called controller advice, so in which class we handle all type of exception. This is like you heard about AOP, aspect oriented programming language, where we create a point of contact where it is a single point of contact which handles all type of exception. So anywhere in the class, any class in the application exception occurred, so for every exception we create a common error response model. Okay, so that it will be easy for user to understand what is the error occurred in the application. Okay, it is if you maintain a particular error handler class with a particular error handler model, it is easy for us to write code and maintain this application, right? So we cannot write different error model where we display different kind of errors for different kind of exception, right? So that will be very it will create a lot of code, unnecessary code. So it will create some confusion. Boilerplate code will be more in that case. So when you create a common model where you can specify all type of details with respect to error exception occurred. Okay, so something like you can see error message, error id, error details. You can add more parameters like date, timestamp, etc, any kind of. So that model is common for all kind of exception. So it is handled and we can send that error response back to user on the screen, so that user can see what is the exception occurred. That makes application maintainable. Easily we can find out what is the error exactly, we can trace out, we can exactly fix that exception or any issue with the application. It may be due to data issue, it may be due to code issue. So we can easily find out the issue, right? So if you find like error id or error message you can search through application directly. So where that particular error is coming, so you can directly go to that particular part of code and you can directly fix that code. It is very much easy. So let's try to implement in a Spring Boot application. Okay, so let's create a application Spring Boot starter project. Let's give the application name as exception handler. Okay, click on next. We need to add a Spring Web dependency. Let's click finish. Okay, so Spring Boot project is created. Let's add a property called server dot port. So we make this one running in a particular port. 8089 is not used in any other application, so I am using 8089. Okay, let's create a we can say let's create a error response model. Okay, first so let's add three variables: error, message, error, error ID and error details. Okay, let's generate a getter setter methods. So we have created a error response model. Let's create a exception handler class. Let's give the name as global exception handler. Okay, so we have to annotate this with controller controller advice. Okay, so let me copy the code which I have already have. I will explain you. So what is okay, so before this one, so we have created this class, right? So before this one we will create a exception. Okay, what type of exception we are going to throw? Okay, so I am saying user not found exception. Extending runtime exception. Okay, So I will explain you what are these constructor. So let's implement a serial version ID. So okay, this is the constructor where I am passing error message and the id user id int and error id. Okay, so let's create a, so error message is the exception message we are throwing, that will be captured in the error message. Okay, so let's create a error id variable super string dot format I am setting a error id with the error id what we got in the constructor. Okay, let's create a getter method for error id. Okay, so this is our custom exception, user not found exception. So where I am passing a error message and user id and error id. So we have to use these all these things to prepare a error response. Okay, now let's create a user class. So it is having two parameters, int id and string name. Okay, let's generate a getter setter. Okay, now user class is ready. Now we will create a controller class. Let's say user controller. So let's annotate this with REST controller and add a request mapping. Give the path as a users. Okay, so let's create a method public get user by id. Okay, so let's pass user id in the path where as a path variable. Let's annotate this one with get mapping. So where we take id as a input. Okay, so let's create a service class before continuing this one, so that we can use service class here to call the method. Okay, So let's create a service class called user service. Okay. So let's annotate this with service. I have a logic already created. Let me open. Let me explain you what are all things we have to create. Okay. So here I am creating a method called get user by id, where I am passing id as a user id. Okay. So here the logic I have written is, I have list of users. I have created a sample hard coded user with setting user id as 1234 with the name, okay, Ramu. So I am iterating the list of users and I am comparing the user id with the input user id. So if user found, I am making the flag as true and returning the particular user. Okay. So if user not found, then I am throwing a error message user not found exception. So passing the user id for which exception occurred and I am passing the error id. I am hard coding the error id 101. Okay. So let's go to controller. We have to call the method in the service class. Okay, let's call the service method. So it is throwing a exception, so we are catching that exception. Let's return the response. Okay, now so it is calling the user method get user by id. So it is returning the, if user found in the list, so it is returning particular user, otherwise it is throwing a user not found exception. Okay. Let's concentrate on global exception handler. So where actually the exception is handled, and here we are preparing a error response and we are returning that error response. Okay. Let's copy this one. So I will show explain you. So what are all things we are doing here. Okay. So we have to create a method handle user not found exception for particular custom exception we have created. Okay. We have to pass that exception and web request as a request. So whenever request comes to controller, it goes to service where exception is thrown, right. So once the exception is thrown, so it will come to this controller advice, since there is no exception handler in any class in controller or anywhere, so it comes here and exception is handled. Okay. Let's import the package. Okay. We have given the name as wrong one. Let's correct the module name as error response. Okay, you can see it was the wrong one, so let's import the. Okay, now error response imported was wrong, so let's import the correct one. So we are getting let's import the correct one. Okay, okay, so we have given the. Okay, so we have to write set error message and set error details. Okay, now it is correct. Okay, so what is happening? So when the where is service class throws an user not found exception, custom exception, so it goes to global exception handler. So it finds particular exception handler method, like here we have defined user not found exception with the exception handler annotation, right. So it goes to this method, there it will create a error response. So whatever error message we are setting, it will return back. Okay, suppose if it is not a user not found exception, so we have to handle some general exception, right. So for that one I have created another exception handler method. So this method, what it will do? So it will handle the general exception. So where exception is thrown, so it will handle all kind of general exception. Okay, let's test this one. So we are sending the error response with internal server as a error. Okay, so we are now ready with all. So let's run this application. First we will build this application. Okay, using a Maven build. So build is successful. So let's run the application. You can see application started on a port 8089. Okay, let's test this. Okay, so to test this application, we have a method called get user by id. Okay, it is a get method. So where we have to pass id, so it will call service method called get user by id. Okay, so it has a list of users. So if it find the particular user id in the list of users, it will return user, otherwise it will say user not found and throw a exception with exception message for particular id and with error id. Okay, let us test this one. So we can first we will test positive scenario. We will try to get the 1 2 3 4 id, right. So it is saying no static resource user 1 2 3 4. Okay. So since the user is exist, it is throwing error called no static resource users, because let us go to controller. So let us check. Since this is a general exception, because if you can see here the context path, the request mapping we have given slash user, but here if you can see it is we have given users. So the path is itself is wrong. So it the controller, it didn't go to this method in the controller itself, it directly gone to controller exception handler. So it went inside handle general exception. So here I have printed I am inside handle general exception, right. So in the console you can see I am inside handle general exception. Okay, so it came here and it returned the exception. So exception message is actually no static resource users 1 2 3 4. So this is a particular exception Spring Boot is returning. So we are not setting any error id, so it is printing null as a error id, and this is the exceptions stack trace details we are returning. Let us test the positive scenario by correcting the user I mean the request path. Okay, let us test this one. See, you can see the response came. So since it found this user 1 2 3 4 and name Ramu, we have already have this user present in the users list. So we have hard coded this one. So it is returning this response. Let us test, suppose pass 1 2, but so since 1 2 is id is not there in the list. Okay, so we do not have that user, so it should return user not found exception with this error message. Let us test this one. So you can see user not found for id 12 101 error id. So we are setting the error id as 101, it is returning error details, the stack trace we have set in the exception. Okay, so it now it gone to this handle user not found exception. So it is setting error id whatever we are setting, and it is setting error details, the stack trace and the error message whatever we are throwing. So this is how we write a custom exception to handle the exceptions. Okay, so suppose let's throw another exception. Suppose instead of user not found exception, so let's make it a general exception. We have already seen the general exception in the first, right? So that is occurred due to the context path we have given, that is wrong. So in real scenario that will not occur, because so the context path we are configuring, it will be a correct one, right? So let's suppose let's throw a general exception. Okay, let's say exception, let's say I had a message called error occurred due to some issue. Okay, now let's test this application. Okay, so let's build this application one more time. We have already that build, let's use that one to build the application. So you can see build is successful. Let's try to run this application. Okay, so application is started. Let's try to run this. So let's pass some other user ID 879. So this is not exist. Now we have to see the exception, something we have provided here, right? So it should show error occurred due to some issues. Okay, so this exception should go to a handle general exception method, and we have to see error message, and error id is not set, so it should be null, then error details. Okay, so we have to see the console also, it is printing, it will print I am inside handle general exception. Okay, let's test this one. See, you can see the error occurred due to some issue, and error id is null, and this is the stack trace. So it gone to handle general exception. So you can see in the console, let's, okay, so I am inside handle general exception. Okay, so this is how general exception, you can add many custom exception, like user, you have added here handle user not found exception. Suppose you are working on some product, and you have to throw product not found exception, any kind of custom exception you want to create. So you can handle, you can create a same kind of something like this, and name that one handle, suppose product exception, and you have to specify that custom exception product exception here, and you have to use that product exception and set that error response with the exception message error id something. Okay, this is how exception is handled globally. So this is very useful, like when you have to handle exception in any class, like there are so many classes, we cannot write exception handling logic for all the classes. This makes very comfortable, and which saves lot of time for developers and which removes lot of boilerplate code, right? Okay, so thank you so much. Please subscribe my channel. Please before watching this video, that will be helpful for me to create more videos on Java, Spring Boot, new technologies. Okay, thank you so much.